I live alone in the mountains, where winter doesn't forgive mistakes. So when I opened my door that night and saw a pregnant black panther sitting silently in the snow, I didn't feel fear first. I felt something worse. I realized she hadn't come here by accident. She had come because she was out of time. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Winter has a way of shrinking your world. When the snow comes early and stays late, everything you once knew begins to feel farther away than it really is. Roads disappear first, then voices, then slowly, even memories stop visiting as often as they used to. I live alone in a small cabin at the edge of the mountains, where the forest thickens and the silence feels heavier with every passing year. At 73, I've learned not to expect much from the days anymore. Morning comes, evening follows, and in between, time just settles like snow on an untouched field. I wasn't always alone out here. There was a time when the cabin held warmth that had nothing to do with fire. My wife used to say winter made honest people out of us, that when the world stripped itself down to white and cold, you could no longer hide from who you really were. She loved watching the snowfall through the window, a cup of tea warming her hands, believing that as long as we were together, the cold could never truly reach us. She was wrong about one thing. Winter always finds a way in, sometimes through the door, sometimes through the heart. After she passed, the cabin grew quieter than I thought possible. My son stopped coming not long after that. We had words, the kind that sound smaller when you say them out loud, but echo forever once they've been spoken. He wanted me to leave the mountains, said this place was killing me slowly. I told him this place was the only thing that still felt honest. He left before the snow fell that year, and he hasn't been back since. People say time heals things. What they don't tell you is that time also freezes them in place if you let it. By the time this winter arrived, I had settled into a routine built around survival rather than living. Wake before sunrise, feed the fire, clear the steps, eat whatever was easy, speak to no one unless necessary. Nights were the hardest. The wind would press against the cabin like it was trying to remember what warmth felt like, and the trees would creak under the weight of snow, sounding almost alive. I told myself that silence was peace, that being alone was safer than being disappointed again. I believed that, or at least I wanted to. That evening was no different from the others. Snow had been falling since afternoon, thick and steady, burying everything familiar until the world outside looked unrecognizable. I sat in my chair near the door, watching the fire struggle against the cold, listening to the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall. There are moments when you feel time slowing down around you, like it's deciding whether to keep going or stop altogether. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that nothing unexpected comes to people like me anymore. That's when I heard the breathing. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through a crack somewhere in the cabin. Winter plays tricks on your ears, especially when you've lived long enough to doubt your senses. But this sound was different, heavier, closer. I froze in my chair, every muscle tightening as I listened again. The fire crackled, the clock ticked, and there it was. Slow, deliberate breathing just beyond the door, muffled by snow, but unmistakably alive. I didn't move, I didn't speak, I just listened. Living out here teaches you caution. You learn which sounds belong to the forest and which ones don't. This one didn't belong. Whatever stood outside my door wasn't passing through. It wasn't lost. It was waiting. I felt a strange tightening in my chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The same feeling you get when life nudges you awake after you've been pretending to sleep for too long. I stood slowly, my joints protesting, and took a step toward the door. The wood felt colder than usual beneath my hand, as if the night itself had pressed against it for warmth. For a brief moment I considered turning back, sitting down, and letting the sound fade into memory like everything else had. At my age, you learn how easy it is to ignore things, how comfortable silence can become. But the breathing continued, and standing there in the glow of the fire, with the snow falling endlessly outside, I understood something with a clarity that unsettled me. Whatever was on the other side of that door had already made its way through the storm, through the cold, through the dark, and now it had chosen my cabin, my door, as the place to stop. I reached for the latch. The latch resisted for a moment, stiff from the cold, and that hesitation felt heavier than it should have. I remember thinking how strange it was that such a small movement could feel like a decision you couldn't take back. When the door finally opened, the cold rushed in immediately, sharp and unforgiving, carrying with it the smell of pine, ice, and something else I couldn't place at first. My breath turned white in front of me as the light from inside spilled out onto the snow, cutting a pale shape into the darkness. That's when I saw her. At first, my mind refused to give the shape a name. It was too large, too solid, crouched low in the snow just beyond the doorway. Snow clung to her back and shoulders, dusting her black fur with white, making her look carved from the night itself. She didn't move when the light hit her. She didn't flinch or bare her teeth. She simply lifted her head slightly and looked at me. Not the way an animal looks at prey, not even the way a wild thing looks at a threat. She looked at me the way something exhausted looks at its last option. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust, and when they did, fear finally caught up to understanding. A black panther, massive, muscles shifting subtly beneath her coat, strength still present even as the cold pressed in on her. And then I noticed her belly. Heavy, low, unmistakable. She was pregnant, very pregnant. The realization hit me harder than the sight of her size. Danger I could understand, hunger too. But this was something else entirely. I didn't move. My hands stayed on the edge of the door, my body half hidden inside the cabin, like I could still retreat if I needed to. Every story I'd ever heard about wild animals rushed forward at once, each one louder than the last. And yet, standing there in the snow, none of them fit what I was seeing. She wasn't pacing, she wasn't growling, she wasn't testing the distance between us. She was sitting, her weight shifted carefully, as if even lowering herself fully might cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. Her breathing was the sound I'd heard before, slow, strained, controlled. Each breath fogged the air in front of her muzzle before disappearing into the falling snow. Her eyes never left mine. There was no panic in them, no aggression, only focus. And beneath that focus, something I hadn't expected at all. Urgency. Not the kind that comes from anger, but the kind that comes from knowing time is running out. The wind picked up, driving snow sideways across the clearing, and I realized how long she must have been out there, how far she must have come. Panthers don't wander into places like this without reason. The forest around my cabin was thick and unforgiving, especially in winter. Every step through that snow would have drained her strength, and yet here she was, choosing to stop at my door instead of collapsing somewhere unseen. That choice unsettled me more than her size ever could. I thought about closing the door. The idea flashed through my mind like instinct, sharp and immediate. This was a wild animal, a predator. Pregnant or not, the risk was real. I told myself that fear was reasonable, that caution was wisdom, that survival depended on knowing when to step back. But as I stood there, watching snow gather slowly on her fur, I realized something uncomfortable. She wasn't here to challenge me. She was here because she couldn't go any farther. She lowered her head then, just slightly, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been watching so closely. The gesture wasn't submission. It was restraint, as if she understood how thin the space between us really was, between fear and trust, between instinct and choice. My heart hammered against my ribs, and for the first time in years I felt truly awake. The snow kept falling, steady and relentless, filling the silence between us. I could feel the cold creeping into my bones, but I didn't step back inside. I couldn't. Something about the way she waited there, patient and unmoving, told me this moment wasn't meant to be rushed, that whatever came next depended on what I did now, not later, not after I thought it through, now. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and took a small step forward onto the snow-covered threshold. The panther's ears flicked, but she didn't retreat. She just watched me, eyes dark and unblinking, as if measuring not my strength, but my resolve. Standing there, separated by nothing but cold air and falling snow, I understood with unsettling clarity that this night had already crossed a line. And once crossed, there would be no going back. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The snow fell steadily between us, softening the edges of everything it touched, showing no concern for the impossible meeting happening beneath it. My breath came out slow and shallow, each exhale fogging the space between my face and hers. I was close enough now to see the fine dusting of frost clinging to the tips of her whiskers, close enough to notice the subtle tremor running through her flank as she shifted her weight. Strength was still there, coiled and dangerous if needed, but it was being held back, deliberately, like a door left unclosed. Then she did something I didn't expect. She looked past me, not over my shoulder in fear, not toward the warmth of the cabin. She turned her head slightly, eyes scanning the dark forest behind her, the white expanse stretching away between the trees. For a second, her focus left me entirely. Then she looked back again, slow, deliberate, and met my gaze once more. The movement was calm, almost careful, as if she were making sure I was paying attention. When she finally stood, snow slid from her back in a quiet rush, revealing just how massive she really was. Even pregnant, even exhausted, she moved with a kind of grace that made the cold feel sharper by comparison. She took one step away from the door. My heart jumped, instinctively preparing for her to disappear back into the forest. But she didn't run. She didn't even hurry. She walked a few paces into the snow, then stopped and turned back toward me. Her eyes held mine again, steady and unblinking, waiting, not demanding, not pleading, waiting. I felt something tighten inside my chest as understanding settled in. She wasn't leaving. She was inviting me to follow. Every sensible thought in my head told me not to move. I was an old man, standing barefoot in the doorway of a cabin, facing a wild predator in the middle of a mountain winter. The cold alone could kill me if I wandered too far. The forest didn't care about good intentions, neither did nature. I thought about my wife, about my son, about the years I'd spent convincing myself that isolation was safer than connection. Turning back would have been easy. All I had to do was step inside, close the door, and let the night take care of whatever came next. But I didn't. Instead, I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and stepped fully into the snow. The cold bit through the soles of my boots immediately, sharp and unforgiving, but I welcomed it. Pain has a way of cutting through hesitation. The panther watched me carefully as I moved, her body tensing for a moment before relaxing again. When she turned and began walking, she did so slowly, deliberately matching her pace to mine. Every few steps, she glanced back to make sure I was still there, as if she understood exactly how fragile this agreement between us was. The forest closed in quickly once we left the clearing. Snow-laden branches hung low, brushing against my coat, dropping cold powder down my collar with every step. My legs protested almost immediately, the uneven ground hidden beneath the white making each stride uncertain. The panther moved ahead of me with quiet confidence, her paws sinking into the snow without sound, carving a narrow path through the drifts. I followed that path like it was the only solid thing left in the world. As we went deeper, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees in long, hollow breaths. My lungs burned with the cold, each inhale sharp and shallow, but I kept going. I don't know why. Or maybe I do, and I'm just afraid to say it out loud. Following her felt like following something I'd ignored for too long, a pull toward purpose, toward being needed again. I hadn't followed anyone in years, not since the last argument with my son, not since I decided it was easier to stay still. She stopped suddenly, and I nearly walked straight into her. The forest ahead dipped into a shallow ravine, the snow there disturbed, packed down in places where something large had been moving back and forth. The panther stood at the edge, her body tense now, muscles rigid beneath her fur. She looked back at me one last time before turning toward the depression in the snow. The urgency in her eyes had sharpened, no longer patient, no longer calm. Time, whatever little of it she had left, was slipping away. Standing there, my breath coming out in ragged clouds, I understood the truth of what I'd chosen. I wasn't just following an animal into the forest, I was stepping back into a world that still demanded something from me, a world that didn't care about my age, my losses, or my fear. And as I took one more step forward, deeper into the snow, and closer to whatever waited ahead, I realized with a quiet certainty, this was the moment. Everything would change. The ravine was deeper than it had looked from above. Snow had gathered unevenly along its edges, masking the drop beneath a fragile white skin that cracked softly under my boots as I moved closer. Cold air pooled down there, heavier and sharper, carrying a smell that made my chest tighten, earth, ice, and something raw. The panther stood at the edge, her body rigid now, no trace of the calm patience she'd shown before. This place mattered. This was as far as she could bring herself to go. She paced once along the rim, slow and deliberate, her tail cutting a dark line against the white ground. Each step looked measured, controlled, but I could see the strain in her movement now. Her breathing had changed again, shorter, quicker, and when another contraction passed through her, she stopped completely, lowering herself into the snow with a quiet, strained sound that carried more fear than pain. Seeing her like that stripped away the last of my doubt. Whatever she needed was here. Whatever was wrong, it was waiting just below us. I shone my flashlight downward, the beam cutting through the swirling snow and into the hollow beneath. At first, I saw nothing but shadow and uneven drifts pressed against exposed roots and broken branches. Then the light caught something darker against the ice, disturbed snow, packed tight in a narrow channel, leading into a low, collapsed opening beneath the embankment. It looked like it had once been a den, tucked safely beneath the roots of an old tree, before the winter storms had brought half the slope down on top of it. The panther followed the beam of light with her eyes. When it reached the opening, she let out a low sound from deep in her chest. Not a growl, not a warning, but something closer to despair. She stepped forward, then stopped abruptly, her body trembling as another wave of pain rolled through her. She could go no farther, not now, maybe not ever. And in that moment, the weight of her choice settled fully on me. She hadn't brought me here because she trusted humans. She brought me here because she trusted me. I slid down the edge of the ravine carefully, snow giving way beneath my boots, cold seeping through my clothes as I lost my footing and caught myself against the frozen earth. My hands burned as I steadied myself, fingers numb almost instantly. The opening was lower than I expected, barely high enough to crouch beneath, and the air coming out of it felt wrong, too still, too cold. I aimed the flashlight inside, my heart pounding hard enough that I could hear it over the wind. That's when I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it, thin, broken, like breath scraping against ice. It came again, sharper this time, and I felt my stomach drop. I moved closer, lowering myself to the ground despite the ache screaming through my knees, and swept the light deeper into the hollow. The beam landed on a small shape half buried in snow and debris, pressed against the frozen earth where the roof had collapsed. Black fur, barely visible beneath a crust of ice. Too small, too still. A cub. My throat closed around the word as I stared at it. my mind struggling to catch up to what my eyes were telling me. The cub's chest moved, barely, each breath a fragile effort against the cold. One paw twitched weakly, scraping at the snow as if it had forgotten what warmth felt like. I reached out without thinking, stopping myself only when the reality of what I was doing caught up to me. Above us, the panther let out another low sound, louder now, filled with a panic she could no longer contain. I turned back toward her, meeting her eyes across the distance. She was standing now despite the pain, her body tense, ready to tear the world apart if she needed to. But she didn't move toward me. She didn't charge. She stayed where she was, watching every movement I made, trusting me with something no wild animal ever should. Her cub, her future, everything. Snow continued to fall into the ravine, each flake stealing what little warmth remained. I looked back at the cub, then at the collapsed den above it, and felt the urgency slam into me with brutal clarity. There was no time to think, no time to hesitate. Whatever happened next had to happen now, because if I failed here, winter would finish what the storm had started. The cold hit me all at once as I lowered myself into the ravine, seeping through my coat, my gloves, my bones, like it was determined to claim me along with everything else down there. Snow slid into my sleeves as I crawled closer to the cub. The ground beneath me uneven and slick with ice. My fingers felt clumsy, slow to respond, and I forced them to move, knowing that hesitation was a luxury neither of us had. The cub's breathing was so shallow now that I had to lean in close, just to be sure it was still alive. I glanced up once toward the edge of the ravine. The panther stood motionless against the white sky, her silhouette massive and tense, muscles coiled tight beneath her fur. Her eyes never left me. I could feel her restraint like a physical thing, a force held back by nothing but trust. One wrong movement, one sign of harm, and that trust would shatter. I was painfully aware of how fragile the balance was. An old man crouched in the snow, hands shaking, holding the fate of something that belonged to the wild. I reached the cub and brushed the snow away gently, careful not to jostle its small body. Its fur was stiff with ice, tiny whiskers frozen together, eyelids fluttering weakly as it let out a thin sound that barely carried through the ravine. I wrapped my scarf around it instinctively, pressing it close to my chest, hoping the warmth might be enough to remind its body how to fight. The cub twitched once, then went still again, and fear tightened its grip around my chest. My phone felt impossibly heavy in my pocket as I pulled it out, my fingers numb as I struggled to unlock the screen. The cold drained the battery faster than I'd expected, the display dimming as if it too wanted to sleep. I managed to dial the local wildlife rescue line, my voice rough and unsteady as I explained where I was, what I'd found, how little time we had. The woman on the other end listened in silence before telling me help was on the way. Snowmobiles, she said, but the storm would slow them down. I looked down at the cub, then back up toward the panther. Waiting might be enough, or it might not. Winter doesn't care which. Another contraction rippled through the panther's body, and this time she cried out, a sound low and raw, stripped of all control. It echoed through the ravine and into the trees beyond, carrying something ancient and desperate with it. She lowered herself again, breath coming fast, snow gathering on her back as if the mountain itself was pressing her down. She was losing strength. I could see it now, unmistakably. If the cub survived but she didn't, I wasn't sure which outcome would haunt me more. I shifted my position, bracing myself against the frozen earth, shielding the cub from the wind with my body as best I could. My legs had gone numb, pain replaced by a strange heaviness that scared me more than the cold itself. I forced myself to keep moving, rubbing the cub gently, whispering words I hadn't spoken aloud in years, encouragements, promises, lies meant to keep hope alive. Above me, the panther watched, her breathing ragged, her eyes burning with a focus that never wavered. Time stretched thin, every second loud in my ears. The storm thickened, snow falling harder now, erasing our tracks, swallowing sound. I thought about my wife, about the winters we'd weathered together, about the nights we'd believed we were safe just because we were warm. I wondered if this was how she'd felt toward the end, aware of the cold, but holding on anyway. The thought steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. Headlights finally flickered through the trees, distant and weak, but unmistakable. Relief surged through me so sharply it almost knocked the breath from my lungs. I raised my arm, waving despite the pain, despite the stiffness, shouting into the storm until my voice cracked. The panther lifted her head, eyes tracking the movement of light with wary intensity, her body tensing again, ready to protect what little she had left. As the sound of engines grew louder, I realized something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Whatever happened next, whatever the rescue brought with it, would change everything. Not just for the cub, not just for the panther, for me. Because winter hadn't finished deciding yet. The sound of engines cut through the storm like something unreal, sharp and mechanical against the endless hush of falling snow. Two snowmobiles emerged between the trees, their lights bouncing wildly over the white ground as they slowed near the ravine. The sudden noise broke the fragile balance of the night. I felt it immediately. The panther did too. Her body surged with renewed strength, muscles tightening as she rose to her feet despite the pain, a low warning rumble vibrating through her chest. She stepped closer to the edge, positioning herself between me and the approaching lights, every instinct screaming at her to protect what little she had left. I raised my hands quickly, heart hammering, and turned toward her before the rescuers could get any closer. I spoke without thinking, my voice shaking but loud enough to carry through the wind. I told her to stay, told her I wasn't leaving, told her the cub was alive. I don't know which words mattered, or if it was the sound itself, the same voice she'd trusted enough to follow. But something in her posture shifted. The rumble in her chest softened, though her eyes never left the strangers approaching through the snow. The rescuers stopped several yards back, experienced enough to read the tension in the air. One of them killed the engine, letting the silence creep back in. Another spoke quietly, asking me to move away from the cub. I shook my head and gestured instead, explaining in broken sentences, pointing first to the panther, then to her belly, then to the collapsed den behind me. They understood quickly. This wasn't a removal. It was a negotiation. They moved slowly, deliberately, each step announced, no sudden motions, no raised voices. I eased backward just enough to give them space, while keeping myself between the cub and the edge of the ravine. The panther's eyes flicked between us, calculating, weighing risk against desperation. Snow clung to her whiskers, melted, then froze again. Another contraction passed through her, and she faltered, lowering herself with a strained sound that made my chest ache. Whatever strength she had left was being spent just staying upright. One of the rescuers lowered himself beside me, careful and calm, and wrapped the cub in a thermal blanket before placing it gently into a carrier warmed with packs. The cub stirred weakly, letting out a thin cry that cut straight through me. The panther answered instantly, a sharp, anguished sound that echoed off the ravine walls. Her body surged forward a step, fear flashing through her eyes, and for one terrifying moment I thought everything would collapse into chaos. I stepped forward again without thinking. I placed myself squarely in her line of sight and spoke her name, not a real name, not one anyone had given her, but one that came to me in that instant, shaped by need rather than sense. I told her the cub was safe. I told her I wouldn't let them take it away from her. I told her she had done enough. My voice cracked under the weight of it, but I didn't stop. I kept talking until the panic in her eyes softened, until her breathing slowed just enough for her to hear me again. The rescuers worked quickly then, turning their attention to her. They explained in low voices what I had already begun to understand. that the den had collapsed because the slope above it had been weakened, stripped bare by machines, and cutting months before winter arrived. Illegal logging, they said. Clear paths driven straight through protected land. The forest no longer held the snow the way it used to. When the storms came, everything gave way at once. She hadn't wandered into the mountains by accident. She had been pushed. As they prepared a stretcher and sedation, the panther looked at me one last time. Not with fear, not with warning, with something closer to exhaustion and relief tangled together. She allowed them to help her, her massive body finally surrendering to the weight of the night. Snow continued to fall around us, soft and relentless, covering the marks of what had been lost and what had been saved alike. Standing there in the cold, watching the wild submit, not to control but to care, I felt something inside me shift, something long, frozen beginning at last to thaw. The rescue center sat on the edge of town, a low concrete building half buried in snow, its windows glowing softly against the dark. I hadn't planned on going there, not really. I told myself my part was finished once the panther and her cub were loaded onto the sled, but when the snowmobiles pulled away and the forest swallowed their tracks, I felt the old familiar weight return, that sense of leaving something unfinished. So I followed, my truck coughing awake after weeks of disuse, tires crunching over ice as I drove down roads I hadn't taken in years. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet fur. The panther lay on a padded platform behind thick glass, her massive chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, quiet and precise, but she looked smaller somehow under the lights, vulnerable in a way she never had in the forest. The cub rested nearby in an enclosure lined with blankets, its tiny body curled tight, alive, unmistakably alive. Relief washed through me again, gentler this time, less sharp, like a warmth that didn't burn. One of the wildlife officers stood beside me, arms crossed, eyes tired. He spoke softly, as if afraid of disturbing something sacred. He told me what they already knew, but rarely said out loud. The logging had been going on for months, hidden beneath permits and excuses, cutting lines through protected land, until the hills could no longer hold the snow. When winter came, it didn't just bring cold, it brought collapse. Dens failed, trails vanished, animals were forced higher into the mountains, closer to people, closer to danger. He shook his head and said, "She did what she had to do." Those words stayed with me, because I recognized them. I thought about the way I'd chosen isolation after my wife died, how I'd let arguments harden into distance with my son instead of reaching out, how I'd convinced myself that staying still was the same as staying safe. Like the panther, I had adapted to loss by retreating, not realizing the ground beneath me was giving way just as surely. We tell ourselves stories to survive. Sometimes those stories trap us. They told me the panther would survive, that she would give birth under care, with warmth and protection she hadn't known in the wild that winter. The cub, they said, would live too. There would be rehabilitation, relocation once the storms passed, a chance, not at the life she'd had, but at one that wouldn't end in ice and silence. I nodded, grateful, but also aware of something uncomfortable. She would be returned to the forest, I would return to my cabin. Some lives move forward, others remain where they are. When I finally stepped back outside, snow was falling again, thick and slow, settling into the deep ruts left by the snowmobiles. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching it erase the evidence of the night. The forest would look untouched by morning, clean, quiet, but I knew better now. Snow doesn't heal what's broken. It only hides it. The drive home felt longer than usual. The road was empty, the headlights carving a narrow path through the white, and for the first time in years, my thoughts didn't feel heavy. They felt open, unfinished maybe, but open. I realized I was thinking about my son, about the last winter we'd spent together, about how stubborn pride can sound like strength until it leaves you alone. When I reached the cabin, The porch light cut through the snow just as it had the night before. I stood there for a moment, hand resting on the door, listening to the wind move through the trees. The forest felt different now, not quieter, just less distant. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if I was capable of fixing everything I'd left undone. But for the first time in a long while, I knew this. Winter hadn't taken everything. The snow didn't stop when I got home. It never really does out here. It just keeps falling, patient and indifferent, covering yesterday without asking permission. I stood inside my cabin for a long time that night, coat still on, boots dripping melted ice onto the floor, listening to the wind move through the trees the way it always had. Everything looked the same as it had before I opened the door. The chair, the fire, the quiet. And yet, nothing felt untouched. I kept thinking about the way she'd looked at me before they took her away. Not afraid, not angry, just tired and certain. Certain that she'd done what she could. Certain that she'd chosen correctly. That kind of certainty is rare. It doesn't come from strength alone. It comes from knowing when to trust, even when the world has given you every reason not to. I realized then that the night hadn't been about bravery at all. It had been about refusing to turn away when turning away would have been easier. The days that followed were still cold, still quiet, but they carried a different weight. I found myself listening for sounds I used to ignore. The forest didn't feel like a wall anymore. It felt like something I belonged to again. I walked a little farther each morning, stayed outside a little longer, and when the rescue center called with updates, I didn't brace myself for loss the way I used to. I let hope exist without arguing with it. They told me she gave birth safely, strong cubs, warm shelter, care, a future that hadn't existed a week earlier. I thanked them and sat in silence after the call ended, letting the news settle. Outside, snow drifted down from the branches, catching the light like it always had. For the first time since my wife died, I didn't feel like winter was something I had to endure. It was just a season. And seasons, I remembered, are allowed to change. That evening I stood by the door again, the same door I'd nearly left closed. I rested my hand on the latch and thought about all the moments in life that ask quietly instead of loudly. The ones that don't force themselves in, the ones that wait. I thought about my son, about words left unsaid, about how pride can feel like protection until you realize it's built the same walls as fear. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I still don't. But before I turned off the light, I unlocked the door and left it that way. Not because I expected another visitor from the snow, but because I understood something I hadn't before. Some doors aren't meant to keep the world out forever. Sometimes they're there so you can decide when to let life back in. And that night, as the snow continued to fall and the forest breathed quietly beyond the walls, I knew this much was true. The panther came to my door for help, but I was the one who needed saving. Before you go, if this story moved you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe small choices still matter, subscribe. There are more stories waiting.